started to say, we're here to discuss the future of U.S. foreign policy and the role that soft power and cultural diplomacy will likely play in the United States foreign policy and in other countries' foreign policy strategies in the future. First, though, I would like to thank the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for putting this on, and also to salute all of you who are here and have been here during the course of the day. It really is inspiring to see your interest in this subject, and the questions that I've heard raised in the discussion certainly reward the time that you've spent and your interest. We face an increasingly interdependent and international environment in which diplomacy, strategic negotiations, and the understanding of the cultures of different countries and peoples, using that term in the broadest sense, and citizen-to-citizen relationships will play as important a role as other more traditional methods of international relations, including military capacity and economic influence. Can I help you here? You seem to be... I don't know. We have another... All right. Well, I thought it would be best just to pause and then get on with this once we're working again. That looks like one that ties on. Thank you. All right. I think we're underway now. Is that correct? Okay. And we're still only going to use soft power, but effective soft power to proceed. American policy makers have been using soft power and consensus building to further American interests throughout our history, and they will continue to do so as we move into the second decade of the 21st century. It does bear keeping in mind, however, that the primary purpose of the United States foreign policy, as is that of other states, is the preservation of the liberty and security of our people, not simply identifying grounds for international consensus, as soft power and cultural diplomacy are useful in doing. But achieving an international consensus is often instrumental in pursuing the goals of our foreign policy, and even essential. When that's the case, we must work to get it. In this more globalized world, there are many instances in which military power and alliances are not adequate tools for achieving our policy objectives. In trade or in preserving the environment, we see two examples where soft power can be vitally important, and improving other states' understanding of our values through cultural diplomacy can be crucial to reaching consensus on important issues. Moreover, we should remember that the use of force in international relations is generally prohibited, except in self-defense or where authorized by the Security Council. So, for most purposes, soft power and cultural diplomacy are all we have available to gain international consensus where that is what we need. Now, achieving international consensus on important issues requires stable international relations among states whose political legitimacy is secure. This, in turn, depends on governments that respect human rights and political and civil liberties of their people. Governments that do not have the support of their people are inherently unstable as they face inevitable internal threats to their power. Moreover, unstable governments are more difficult to negotiate with, and they can make unreliable partners even when negotiations result in agreements, because their objective is frequently their own regime's maintenance of power, not arriving at agreements that are mutually beneficial to their people and ours. This, then, is a point that I want to dwell on. Promoting political rights and civil liberties is essential to the effective use of soft power and cultural diplomacy, and these human rights can, in turn, most efficiently be promoted by soft power methods, and if our cultural values are properly understood. However, as I shall discuss, there is an enormous amount of work to be done in the promotion of human rights around the world, so reliance on soft power and cultural diplomacy is bound to be a major component of our foreign policy. President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have made soft power a key element in the administration's foreign policy strategy, and they outlined its importance in multiple speeches and publications, including the recently released Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, or the QDDR. This document was the result of a year-long review by America's foreign policy agencies, considering their budgeting processes, strategic initiatives, and management. It outlines a comprehensive overhaul of the way the United States conducts its business abroad and commits to integrating development, diplomacy, and military capabilities as the main components of our foreign policy. It's a sincere and comprehensive examination of America's work abroad. In order to manage the challenges of the 21st century, it's necessary to update our priorities, train our people, and maximize our outputs to achieve our objectives. The administration evidently also recognizes the important role that the promotion of human rights and democratic governance in states around the world must play if our own citizens are to enjoy a safe, secure, and prosperous America. In the QDDR, Secretary Clinton says, and I quote, "While promoting security and prosperity are essential, so too is upholding and projecting the values that define America. We advance these values by living them at home and by supporting those who embrace them around the world. We do not seek to impose our values on other countries by force, but we do believe that certain values are universal, that they are cherished by people in every nation, and that they are intrinsic to stable, peaceful, free, and prosperous countries." This message, a succinct statement of America's cultural diplomacy, is key to the efficacy of American efforts abroad. There are millions of men and women living in horribly oppressive environments who hear messages like that and believe that the United States will support their struggles. In addition to words, of course, thoughtful and consistent actions can demonstrate to the rest of the world that America takes its commitment to supporting human rights seriously. By supporting fundamental human rights, the U.S. earns friends throughout the world. This administration has had no shortage of impressive statements and hopeful messages committing to uphold freedom through its foreign policy. But it is also fair to say that they have not always been backed up by action. Foreign governments, activists, and organizations worldwide look to the United States government to provide leadership on these issues, and when the U.S. neglects to make them a forefront of its actions abroad, the repercussions are felt by the most vulnerable. While the words and actions of the U.S. government regarding the need to protect human rights continues to be of primary importance, in this increasingly interconnected global environment, the methods for spreading these values have decentralized and moved beyond statesmen and diplomats. With the power of technology and more accessible travel, individuals, nonprofit organizations, civil society groups, and businesses can connect with one another in ways unlike ever before. In their own way, each of these entities can become an ambassador of democratic values abroad and helping to uphold human rights standards, open closed societies, and draw attention to instances of repression. This is soft power and cultural diplomacy by non-state actors, but a very important component of our message to the world. One group that has been working to spread the values of democracy and human rights long before the age of Facebook or Skype is Freedom House, where I currently serve as the chairman of the board of trustees. I would like to say a word about this organization because it provides, I think, a good illustration of what soft power and cultural diplomacy can do. Born out of opposition to the rise of dictatorships in Europe in the 1940s, Freedom House has served as a defender of international human rights and democracy for the past 7 decades. Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the founders of Freedom House and its first chairperson, together with Wendell Willkie, was, of course, an integral force in the passing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. After the end of the Second World War, Freedom House continued its mission as a vocal opponent of oppressive regimes worldwide, convinced that the spread of democracy would be the best weapon against totalitarian ideologies, and not content to focus only on abroad. Freedom House was also a staunch opponent of McCarthyism and an early supporter of the American civil rights movement here at home. Over the next 60 years, Freedom House's public advocacy and programmatic work helped support democratic movements and governments in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the former Soviet Union. In 1973, we launched our flagship publication, Freedom in the World, which measures civil rights and political liberties in every country in the world. This publication, which comes out annually, offers policymakers, the media, and the public a comparative view of the state of freedom around the world, a measurement which, as I'm sure you can imagine, doesn't always please many of the governments who find themselves at the bottom of the list. We firmly believe, however, that an accurate understanding of the human condition in political, no less than in medical matters, is essential to improving or securing human rights, and for this reason we publicize our findings and analyses for all to see. In addition to our publicized research and analysis, organizations such as Freedom House serve as an important impetus for the U.S. and foreign governments to take actions that support and protect human rights and democratic development, thus furthering a key priority of American foreign policy. Human rights groups and the activists they work with are often the eyes and ears on the ground in repressive countries, and in many cases are the first to raise the alarm when human rights violations occur. Such groups can offer a different perspective on local events players and developments that will impact American policies as much as the diplomats stationed in country. Thus, it is vital that the U.S. government continue to utilize and partner with non-governmental organizations in their foreign policy formation. By doing so, the U.S. government will be better able to engage in traditional diplomacy and effectively use soft power. Using its well-known annual publications, Freedom House highlights when countries, including the United States, fall short of their human rights commitments and offers praise for governments when they take steps in the right direction. Regrettably, in recent years, the criticism has far outweighed the praise, as there have been notable declines in freedom around the world. The newest version of Freedom in the World will be released next week, and the sad message of the survey for the year 2010 is a decline in the status of global freedom, the fifth consecutive annual decline, albeit a modest one, in the freedom score. With a few exceptions, the countries that embraced democracy during the period around the end of the Cold War have maintained their commitment to free institutions. Indeed, despite taking some severe hits from the global economic crisis, the Baltic states and the countries of Central Europe remain free according to our analysis. The same is true, for the most part, in Latin America and among the democracies of Asia. Although it's safe to say that the overall state of freedom in the world has improved over the past 20 years, subsequent to the fall of the Soviet Union then, there have been major setbacks, particularly recently, in key countries. In 2010, there was no sign of progress in the leading authoritarian states, such as China, Russia, Venezuela, or North Korea. Additionally, although our analysis for 2010 is ongoing, there is evidence to suggest declines in several important countries, including Iran, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and Ethiopia. Perhaps as disturbing, the 2010 survey also found that many of the world's democracies have not supported human rights efforts and democratic development in repressive countries when they could. At times, democratic countries neglected to assist civil society struggling under repressive governments, failed to support resolutions of the United Nations supporting fundamental human rights, bowed to pressure from powerful countries to ignore blatant human rights abuses, and neglected to publicly acknowledge human rights issues during high-profile meetings. They failed, in short, in too many instances, to use soft power and cultural diplomacy when they could, even though their cultures are based on a commitment to human rights and respect for individual freedom. In addition to the failures of established democracies, many of the leading new democracies in the developing world have continued to resist embracing the promotion of democracy and human rights as an important element in their foreign policies. Among the most disappointing in this regard is Brazil, which, despite important strides in the consolidation of domestic democratic institutions, has refused to exert pressure on regional authoritarians like Cuba or Venezuela, and even made a point of befriending Iran's government at the same time as it brutally repressed domestic opposition. Likewise, South Africa has failed to play a significant role in restraining the repressive policies of the Mugabe regime in Zimbabwe, while India has refrained from exerting pressure on the military junta in neighboring Burma. But these states have enormous resources of soft power that could be employed in these situations. When democracies choose to ignore instances of repression, or worse, befriend the oppressors, it tells the men and women suffering under repressive regimes that their struggle will only be supported when it is convenient. And it sends a message to authoritarian governments that their actions won't negatively impact their relations, whether diplomatic, military, or economic, with the democratic world. Thus, we've seen more and more examples of large, strategically important countries, often with strong economic ties to the United States and Europe, flagrantly violating their citizens' rights and freedoms. It has become clear that countries like China, Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia will pose significant challenges to United States foreign policy in coming years, in addition to other rogue states like Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. And an important part of that challenge is to the legitimacy of our culture of political rights and civil liberties. Cultural diplomacy must meet this challenge. Perhaps one of the most blatant and consistent violators of human rights today is China. China is rated not free in Freedom House's Freedom in the World and in the Freedom of the Press Index, continuously earning the lowest possible score in the political rights category. Instances of political repression and ethnic violence have been increasing since the 2008 Olympics, including violent crackdowns against the Uyghurs and minority religious groups. The internet in China is strictly censored, and journalists, bloggers, and lawyers are harassed and often jailed. Recently, China's grave abuses have received increased international attention after the Nobel Prize was awarded to jailed Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo. China's attempts to bully Norway and the international community to prevent this award, and subsequently into boycotting the award ceremony, were thankfully met with widespread defiance. However, 18 countries, some expected, some more surprising, were persuaded to skip the ceremony which they normally attend. One would expect countries such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Cuba to accede to China's requests in this case. More troubling was the absence of countries such as the Philippines, Colombia, and Morocco from the ceremony. Despite the unwelcome attention to their human rights abuses, China continues its attacks against political dissent and ethnic minorities. Yet, the democratic world, including the United States, has been largely silent on these issues when publicly dealing with Chinese leaders. President Obama briefly raised the issue of human rights when he visited China in 2009, but many activists and human rights groups feel that this was not enough. The neglect of these issues in public can only lead China to think that it can bully the rest of the world into acceding to its political pressure. And indeed, if you go to China, this is what they will tell you is the case, namely that the Obama administration and other states don't give a priority to human rights, and that this is good. The Obama administration will, of course, have a second chance to confront China on its human rights abuses when President Hu Jintao makes an official state visit to the U.S. in January. Human rights groups are already calling on the President and the Secretary of State to utilize this opportunity to press China on its human rights record, and activists and dissidents in the region are looking to the United States for leadership on this issue. A lack of focus on these issues during this trip will reinforce the Chinese perception that they can do whatever they want at home without any repercussions abroad. It will also be an indication of the extent to which the United States truly is committed to the use of soft power and cultural diplomacy in forwarding human rights. In Russia, the political situation continues to stagnate as Vladimir Putin finishes his 11th year as the dominating personality in Russian political life. Russia, too, is rated not free in both the Freedom in the World and Freedom of the Press reports. The powerful executive branch maintains its tight controls on the media, civil society, and other branches of government, and promised judicial and police reforms have gone unrealized. Although the Constitution provides, the Russian Constitution provides for freedom of speech and of the press, officials used the country's politicized and corrupt court system, including dozens of criminal cases and hundreds of civil cases, to harass and prosecute the few remaining independent journalists who dare to criticize widespread abuses committed by the authorities. At one point, there was reason to hope that Russia would emerge from the debris of the Soviet Union as a democratic state, subject to the rule of law. However, more than 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is clear that Russia has returned to an oppressive oligarchy where political rights and civil liberties are severely restricted. The Russian government and civil service continue to face widespread corruption as legal impunity and helps enrich the political elite, and everyday Russians exhibit widespread apathy about their political opportunities. In the Middle East, Egypt continues to be one of the United States' most important allies, receiving upwards of $150 million in foreign assistance every year. But 2010 saw a crackdown on both the media and the internet preceding parliamentary elections that were marred by fraud and repression. President Mubarak once again extended the country's more than 30-year emergency rule, an act which garnered a disappointingly tepid response from the U.S. and Europe. Several high-profile cases of police brutality were emblematic of a growing disregard for rule of law among government security services, which is an especially troubling development in advance of the high-profile election for president, which is set for September of this year. Yet, Egypt remains an important American ally and partner in the Middle East, and this administration, like those before it, has had difficulty balancing the desire to criticize with the fear of antagonizing an important partner. The result has been a policy of appeasing the Mubarak regime while failing to provide any significant financial and moral support for Egypt's feisty but beleaguered civil society and media communities. Another blatant abuser of human rights and important military and commercial ally for the U.S., Saudi Arabia, has been ranked not free in both Freedom of the World and Freedom of the Press reports for as long as these reports have ever been published, some 35 years. Saudi Arabia currently earns the lowest possible score in political rights and the second to lowest possible in civil liberties. Repression is widespread in Saudi Arabia, specifically targeting ethnic religious, and national minorities. Political parties are forbidden, and organized political opposition exists only outside the country, with many activists based in London. Of particular concern to the United States, Saudi Arabia has recently been identified as the largest source of funds for Islamist terrorist groups, including the Afghan Taliban. While the funding of terrorism is also a problem in Qatar, the United Arab Republic, and United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, funding coming from Saudi Arabia is especially problematic. Militants enter the country disguised as religious pilgrims and set up companies that receive money from government-backed charities. It has now been established that the Pakistani terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, used funds originating in Saudi Arabia to carry out the dreadful attack in Mumbai in 2008. Saudi Arabia's continued funding of terrorist groups operating in the Middle East seriously threatens America's efforts to create sustainable and peaceful democracies in the region. Indeed, the failure of the countries in the Middle East to improve in their measures of freedom is especially disappointing. At the beginning of the past decade, there were signs of a modest democratic renaissance as the United States and the world generally focused attention on the region's freedom deficit. Over the past 5 years, however, we have witnessed a steady decline, including in important countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Iran. In sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia is considered an important partner in U.S. counterterrorism efforts and receives more than $500 million annually in American foreign assistance. In 2009, the government of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi and his EPRDF party imposed an incredibly repressive NGO law that has all but eliminated organizations working in the areas of human rights and governance. The May 2010 elections were extremely flawed and assured the EPRDF's complete dominance of political life in Ethiopia with a crushing victory in the country's general election. The influence of Ethiopia in the region cannot be overestimated, and there is a concern that its repressive policies are being emulated by governments in Uganda, Eritrea, and Sudan. The United States will not be well served to see increasingly closed societies in that region, which plays host to a variety of terrorists and extremist groups. We must find ways to promote our values and culture of respect for human rights in this area. Now, these are just some of the challenges that the United States faces now and will face in coming years, that must be handled with an intelligent mix of public diplomacy, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, development efforts, and economic pressures. Human rights abuses, poor governance, and consequent potential instability in these countries pose genuine concerns to American security and stability. Equally important, however, they challenge the premise of our culture of individual freedom directly. In these circumstances, cultural diplomacy and soft power will be increasingly important tools in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy as well as in that of other states. Let me stop at that point and take questions, discussion. Thanks.